He was a man who was born into a world of immense creativity and immense pain. A man who was a prodigy. A man who could play the violin before he could speak. A man who could compose music before he could read. A man who was performing for the crowned heads of Europe before he was 6 years old. He was a man who was a genius. A man who was a visionary. A man who was able to create some of the most beautiful and sublime music ever written. And yet he was also a man who was deeply impoverished. A man who was constantly in debt. A man who was often humiliated and rejected. A man who was treated as a servant and a plaything by the aristocracy. A man who was a victim of his own prodigious talent. A man who was a prisoner of his own fame. He was a man who died at the age of 35. A man who was buried in a pauper's grave. A man whose death was so sudden and so mysterious that it has been the subject of speculation and controversy for centuries. This is the story of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a man who is perhaps the most famous and the most beloved composer in the history of Western music. But here is what most people do not realize about Mozart, the man who is remembered as the child prodigy. The man who is celebrated as the embodiment of musical genius was also a man who was deeply flawed. A man who was often childish, a man who was a scatological joker, a man who was a spendthrift, a man who was a poor businessman, a man who was often exploited by his family and by his employers, a man who was a man of immense talent and immense insecurity, a man who was a visionary and a man who was deeply human. To understand Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, you have to go back to the beginning, to the beautiful and ancient city of Salzburg, a small, prosperous city in what is now Austria, nestled at the foot of the Alps, a city that was ruled by a powerful and autocratic Prince Archbishop. He was born on January 27, 1756, into a world of music, a world that was defined by the sounds of the court and the church. His father, Leopold Mozart, was a musician and a composer, a man of immense intelligence and ambition, a man who was determined to make his son a success. His mother, Anna Maria Pertl, was a woman of warmth and humor, a woman who was the anchor of the family. Wolfgang was the seventh and last child of the family, a boy who was born into a world of grief and loss. Only 2 of his siblings survived to adulthood, and he was the youngest. He was a boy who was a prodigy, a boy who showed a remarkable talent for music from a very young age. He began to compose at the age of 5, and he was performing before the crowned heads of Europe before he was 6. He was a boy who was deeply aware of his own talent, a boy who was driven by a relentless need to create. His father recognized his son's extraordinary talent, and he was determined to exploit it. He took Wolfgang and his older sister, Maria Anna, on a series of grand tours of Europe, performing for the courts of Paris, London, and Vienna. The tours were a remarkable success. Wolfgang was a sensation, a child prodigy who was celebrated by the aristocracy and the public. He was a boy who was showered with gifts and adulation, a boy who was treated as a wonder. He was also a boy who was deeply exploited. His father was a taskmaster, a man who was driven by his own ambition, a man who was determined to make his son a success. He worked the young Mozart relentlessly, forcing him to perform and to compose, often at the expense of his health and his education. He was a boy who was a presoer of his own talent, a boy who was forced to grow up too fast. The tours were a formative experience for the young Mozart. He was exposed to the great musical traditions of Europe, and he was able to learn from the masters of the time. He was also exposed to the world of the aristocracy, a world that he would both admire and despise. He was a young man who was deeply aware of his own status. He was a servant, a man who was expected to perform for the entertainment of his masters. He was a man who was deeply resentful of his position, a man who was determined to break free from the constraints of his birth. In 1777, when he was 21 years old, Mozart traveled to Paris, a city that was a center of the musical world. He was hoping to find a position, a patron who would support his work. But he was disappointed. He was treated as a curiosity, a child prodigy who had grown up. He was not taken seriously. He was humiliated, and he was deeply disillusioned. He returned to Salzburg, a man who was deeply frustrated by his lack of success. He was a man who was trapped in a provincial city, a man who was a servant to a powerful and autocratic Prince Archbishop. He was a man who was desperate to break free. In 1781, he finally broke free. He left Salzburg for Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire, a city that was a center of culture and creativity. He was a man who was determined to make his own way in the world. He was a man who was confident in his own abilities, a man who was determined to succeed on his own terms. He settled in Vienna, and he began to build a career as a composer and a performer. He was a man who was a brilliant pianist and an improviser, a man who could captivate an audience. He was a man who was composing some of his greatest works, including The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and The Magic Flute. He was a man who was at the height of his powers, a man who was creating some of the most sublime music ever written. But his personal life was in turmoil. He was a man who was constantly in debt, a man who was a poor businessman, a man who was often exploited by his publishers and his employers. He was a man who was constantly borrowing money, a man who was often on the verge of bankruptcy. He was a man who was deeply insecure, a man who was seeking validation and love. He married Constanze Weber, a woman who was a singer, a woman who was the love of his life. Their marriage was a happy one, but it was also a difficult one. They had 6 children, but only 2 survived to adulthood. They were a couple who were constantly struggling to make ends meet, a couple who were deeply devoted to each other, but who were often overwhelmed by the challenges of their lives. His later years were marked by a growing sense of disillusionment and despair. He was a man who was increasingly frustrated by the limitations of his own success. He was a man who was not content to simply be a popular composer. He wanted to be recognized as a serious artist. He wanted to be respected by his peers and by the aristocracy. But he was often dismissed as a lightweight, a man who was more interested in entertainment than in artistic expression. He was a man who was deeply misunderstood. He was a man who was at the height of his powers. But he was also a man who was on the verge of collapse. In 1791, he was commissioned to write a Requiem, a mass for the dead. It was a work that would become one of his most famous and one of his most mysterious. He was a man who was deeply affected by the commission. He was a man who was obsessed with death, a man who was convinced that he was writing the Requiem for himself. He worked on the work with a feverish intensity, a man who was driven by a sense of urgency and dread. He died on December 5, 1791, at the age of 35. He was buried in a pauper's grave, a man who was forgotten by the world that had once celebrated him. The cause of his death is a mystery, a subject of endless speculation. It was rumored that he was poisoned, a crime that was never solved. It was rumored that he died of a fever, a disease that was common in his time. The truth is lost to history. The legacy of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is one of the most profound in human history. He is remembered as one of the greatest composers in the history of Western music, a man whose works are celebrated for their beauty, their elegance, and their emotional depth. He has been honored with statues, monuments, and museums around the world. He's a man who is considered one of the most influential figures in the history of music. His works continue to be performed and recorded, and they continue to inspire and to move audiences around the world. But his legacy is also a story of tragedy and mystery. He was a man who was a genius, but he was also a man who was deeply flawed. He was a man who was a child prodigy, a man who was exploited by his father and by his employers. He was a man who was a victim of his own prodigious talent, a man who was a prisoner of his own fame. He was a man who was not just a composer, he was a man who was a visionary, a man whose story is a reflection of the power and the tragedy of the creative spirit. Why should someone born today still care about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart? Because his life is a testament to the power of the creative spirit and the importance of perseverance. He was a man who was born into a world of immense talent and immense pain, a man who was a prodigy, a man who was a visionary, and a man who was able to create some of the most sublime music ever written. He showed us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who believed in the power of the human imagination. And he was a man who was not afraid to dream. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who once said, "Neither a lofty degree of intelligence, nor imagination, nor both together go to the making of genius. Love, 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 that is the soul of genius." He was a man who was able to create works of art that are filled with love, with compassion, and with a deep and abiding sense of humanity. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the love we give. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a composer. He was a man who was a poet, a philosopher, a visionary, and a legend. He was a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero. He was a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten.